Welcome to the P.A.S. Report Weekly Roundup Podcast. The P.A.S. Report provides an honest analysis on the critical issues that matter to you without the biased media filters. Here's your host, Professor Nick Giordano.
What's up, everyone? Welcome to another episode of the P.A.S. Report Podcast. This is your host, Nick Giordano. I got a great episode lined up, but before I get to it, I'm glad you could join me today. If you're not already a subscriber, consider subscribing and following this podcast so you never miss an episode. Also, visit the PAS Report website and share this episode with your family and friends. I got a really important issue that I'm going to be discussing today. However, before I get to that, just a reminder, on Monday, I released my interview with Dr. Victor Davis Hanson. It was a fascinating conversation, and if you haven't had the chance to listen yet, I suggest you do. It was a wide-ranging discussion from the weaponization of government to his new book, The End of Everything. And Dr. Hanson, he's a brilliant man. I mean, he's a brilliant historian. He gets it. He offers valuable insights on how to reverse our current trajectory as Western civilization is destroying itself. It's committing suicide through a number of self-inflicted wounds. And he warns us, failure to change this trajectory is going to lead us down the path of past civilization's demise, as foretold in his latest book, The End of Everything. So check it out. But it goes along to what I was talking about last week and what I want to talk about today, because last week I discussed the misplaced priorities of Americans, particularly the younger generation. And I explained how they're fighting harder for TikTok. They're fighting harder for an app than they did as 2 years of their lives were stolen from them through authoritarian decrees. Today, I'm going to focus on an issue that has reached crisis levels in America, and it certainly does not get the attention that it deserves. I'm talking about our nation's mental health. We have a mental health crisis going on. According to a recent Gallup poll, happiness is plummeting. It's plummeting across the country, and it's going down a lot of demographics, but what's even more alarming is that this decline is affecting our youngest generations. I'm talking about children. I'm talking about teenagers, young adults. These are demographics that should be filled with promise. They should be filled with optimism. They should be ready to take on the world. They should feel invincible. I mean, think about when you were that age. Think about when you were 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20 years old. You were on top of the world. These are demographics that should not be suffering from mental health conditions, yet they are. They're grappling with unprecedented levels of anxiety, depressionness, a sense of hopelessness. And the question is why? Why? Now, there's a myriad of reasons, but much of the mental health crisis that we are witnessing can be traced back to a significant shift in our society. You know, a lot of people, they simply want to blame the screens. They want to blame technology. Now, that's certainly a factor. I'm not denying that. But a bigger reason is that we've moved far away from traditional values that once defined American exceptionalism. I'm talking about faith and family, merit, patriotism. They've all been supplanted by a culture that prioritizes a radical ideology, that prioritizes government dependency. See, as we moved away from these traditional values, a void has been created. You know, this erosion, it's been filled by a leftist agenda, an agenda that pushes activism over personal responsibility. Over the last 30 years, we've witnessed an unprecedented assault on the idea of faith, family, and country. We see the far left ideology pushing a reliance on government as opposed to self-reliance. This is a big part of the problem. The rise of what's been termed as the woke culture, it's only exacerbated this problem. But understand that this crisis has been brewing before this woke madness, the woke mind virus that we've been witnessing. However, the wokeness is contributing to the anxiety, the depression, the overall unhappiness within society. The mind virus has infiltrated our education system. It's infiltrated every aspect of society from the earliest of ages, when they're turning on the television, when they tune into Nickelodeon and Disney Channel. From that young age, they're seeing it. And it's a stark reality that we cannot ignore. The numbers are frightening. They should terrify each and every one of you. Suicide ranks as the second leading cause of death among children ages 10 to 14 and young adults ages 20 to 34. You know, the dominant group in suicides used to be middle-aged males, and it still is. They still take the top reins. But middle-aged males that made poor life choices, that their life didn't go as anticipated, they fall into the anxiety and depression, and they ended up committing suicide. But now, when you're talking about 10 to 14-year-olds and 20 to 34-year-olds, the prime of your life, everyone should be concerned about that. This should be one of the main priorities in our country. Another poll shows over half of young adults under the age of 30, over half are grappling with anxiety. Nearly half are experiencing depression and feelings of hopelessness. Now, as a college professor, I have witnessed this firsthand for years. Prior to COVID, prior to the reliance on technology, but those have made things worse. The number of students suffering from mental illness has skyrocketed, and it's not hard to see why. Our educational institutions, they shifted their focus from imparting knowledge to promoting indoctrination and activism. See, when you don't have any faith, when you don't have a real family, when you don't have real relationships, something has to fill that void. And the left does it with issues and activism. And people get more depressed, they get more anxious. You have concepts like diversity, equity, and inclusion, the pursuit of social justice that have taken precedence over merit, academic rigor, critical thinking. But it's not just our education system that's to blame. We have to acknowledge that. Again, too many want to put the focus on technology, and I'm not dismissing that. Technology plays a significant role as well. You have advancements in technology that have undoubtedly brought about numerous benefits, but they've also contributed to this sense of isolation, this disconnection among our youth. You have social media in particular that has been linked to increased feelings of anxiety and depression. Young people constantly comparing themselves to others. Even though everything that we see online is fake, it's not real. I always say, you take 1,000 pictures and you post the best one of the family where everyone's smiling, but that's not real life, right? Real life, when you have kids, how much did it take to get to that picture? How much yelling and screaming did it take to make sure everyone's looking at the camera and actually smiling? How many F-bombs were dropped in that process? But we only see what we want to see online. We don't understand all the problems that may come along with what's going on in our lives. We ignore that. And so we have these unrealistic expectations, portrayals of other people's lives that contributes to the depression and anxiety that we're seeing today. But it's not the sole factor when we look at technology. Then you have the authoritarian response to the pandemic. And that certainly has worsened the situation. Lockdowns, school closures, masks, vax mandates. We saw the erosion of personal freedoms right before our eyes. And nobody stood up for it. Well, I don't want to say nobody, but very few people stood up to that. And that took a toll on young people. It affected the mental well-being of millions of young Americans who were robbed of essential interactions, life experience, major life milestones. They were robbed of that. Do you know what kind of impact that had to have on them? And then people wonder, why is this generation, why is the younger generation, why are they suffering? We have to wonder. Look at what many adults did to them. However, even though the situation may seem bleak, there is hope. And by acknowledging the root cause of the crisis and addressing those root causes, maybe we could reverse the tide of despair and hopelessness that has gripped our nation. And it all starts with the return to the values that made America an exceptional nation to begin with. Values deeply rooted in faith, family, merit, and patriotism. And I'm going to break it all down when we get back from this quick commercial break, so everyone hang tight. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everyone. So for this segment, I want to discuss how the education system is partly fueling this crisis. Again, it's not the only thing fueling it. There are a lot of other factors, but it's partly to explain what's going on in our society, because people tend to think the mental health crisis is solely about technology and screen time, but that couldn't be further from the truth. As I said in the opening, there are a myriad of factors, and we cannot dismiss what's going on in our education system. See, the emphasis on wokeism in education, combined with the decline of traditional values, it's a toxic concoction. And it's fueling anxiety, depression, and unhappiness, especially among young people. Our educational institutions were once revered as a place where you could get knowledge, you could learn to think critically, you could be enlightened. However, they've become breeding grounds for leftist indoctrination and activism. Now, this has been going on for a long time. However, it's hit warp speed over the last few years, particularly in the last 3 years, when you have influential figures like Randy Weingarten, who did more to destroy education in this country than any other person that I could think of. And you even have people like President Biden who have been complicit in diminishing the role of parents in education policy. They arrogantly assert that children belong to the state, that they're pawns of the state, essentially. That when they're in the classroom, they don't belong to you as parents, but they are now wards of the state. And they said this on numerous occasions. When we look inside the classroom, you have students that are subjected to narratives steeped in anti-American sentiment and even anti-Semitic propaganda. Instead of instilling pride in our nation's history, instead of instilling pride in our values and our national identity, our education system fosters division and resentment. It perpetuates a sense of victimhood and guilt, and it's doing it among impressionable minds. These aren't children that have developed the capacity to push back on their teachers. These aren't children that develop the capacity to think critically yet, to use reason and logic. So what their teachers are telling them or what's in the curriculum, they're going to take, and that's what they're going to believe. Take the idea of toxic masculinity. We've seen that become a big thing in schools, that boys are increasingly told that their natural traits, their natural instincts, their natural behaviors are problematic. It's toxic. Instead of celebrating the unique qualities that make boys, well, be boys, we've seen this push to feminize them, to suppress their energy levels. I mean, think about every time a little kid can't sit in his chair. Rather than say, well, that's a kid just being a kid, they got ADHD, got to prescribe them some drugs, give them some powerful narcotics to calm them down. And then we wonder why so many young men are feeling alienated and disengaged from the education system. We wonder why so many people have dropped out of a higher education. So many males have dropped out of a higher education system. Maybe they don't want to be told that they're so toxic. How many men have left the workforce over the last few years? And I'm talking about young adults here. Why? Why is that the case? Well, when you constantly bashing someone, especially for something that's out of their control, well, it starts to get into their psyche. And then you see this shift away from cultivating critical thinking skills towards indoctrination and activism. And we've seen this on a widespread scale. Just look at the discredited 1619 Project, this divisive curriculum that assigns guilt and victimhood based on racial and ethnic characteristics. Well, constantly telling someone that they're an oppressor, that they're inherently racist, they're inherently implicitly biased, and constantly telling someone else that they're a victim, that the system's against them, that they're going to face racism in every single aspect of their life. Do you think that doesn't impact the kid's mind? Do you think that doesn't foster shame and resentment, tribalism among the student body, among the young minds? Of course it does. You have students being told that America is such a horrible country, an evil country, that the whole basis of America was that it was built on the concept of slavery. It was built on the concept of committing genocide against Native Americans. Who's going to have national pride in that? Nobody's going to be like, oh, I'm proud to be American, even though, we're being told that the whole basis of our country was steeped in this idea of slavery, even though we're told that we committed a genocide against Native American tribes. And our history is much more complicated than that. It's not as simple. It's not as black and white as they tend to make it out to be. It's much more complicated. And rather than teach the totality of the American experience, both the good and the bad, they simply want to focus on the negative aspects in order to push a narrative. I'm not saying don't teach about slavery, don't teach about what happened to the Native Americans, don't teach about Japanese. I'm not saying that we sugarcoat our history. What I am saying is that they're not really teaching history to our students. It's why only 13% of students demonstrate proficiency in American history. It's pathetic. Then you look at our education system's approach to teaching other topics like climate change, and it only adds fuel to the fire. We have this climate alarmism framed as climate justice that's instilling fear and anxiety in students, telling the students that they're screwed, that there's going to be this climate apocalypse that exists. And it paints a bleak picture of the future for them. It's a fear tactic that's being used. There's no doubt about it. Students are told that humanity is going to perish in this climate apocalypse for which they bear responsibility. And while previous generations were conditioned and encouraged to view the future as full of opportunities, today's youth are bombarded with doom and gloom that their carbon footprint is responsible. How could they not feel depressed? How could they not feel anxious? And we have the numbers to back it up. 75% of young people express concern about climate change, with 62% reporting that they have climate anxiety and 67% of them reporting that they have climate fear. Climate fear. This reminds me of during the coronavirus when they were telling children, you don't want to be the ones responsible for killing grandma and grandpa. That's how horrible they are. To put that on the shoulders of little kids where they don't bear responsibility for the passing of their grandparents. And yet that's what they did. It's all about fear, because fear is a great motivator. Another really concerning thing within our education system is the lowering of standards in the name of equity, redefining proficiency and lowering expectations. Our education officials are sending a clear message to these students that mediocrity is acceptable because they cannot achieve. The lack of belief in their abilities is only going to further erode students' self-esteem and their sense of purpose. When you tell students that they're too dumb, that they can't possibly catch up, they can't possibly meet the proficiency levels, and so we have to lower the standards. What does that tell students? It tells them that you don't care. It tells them that you don't have any hope or faith in them. And as a result, what do we witness? Well, we witness so many young Americans that lack any meaning or direction in life. You look at the colleges where these messages are amplified. Now, college should be an experience that gives young adults a sense of direction and purpose in life. Over the last 2 decades, the number of Americans with college degrees has doubled. So why is it that 58% of young adults, they go to this place, this institution called college, where they're supposed to find their direction in life? And instead of finding it, they say they come out, they lack meaning or purpose. Half feel that they have no sense of direction once they go to college. So instead of preparing students to become productive citizens, we inculcate fear and activism in them. Anyone who does not bow to the altar of social justice is ridiculed and ostracized. So you must fall in line. And this makes young Americans withdraw from the system. They grow isolated. And it's no wonder why so many of them are suffering from mental health issues. You see it. But the blame cannot solely rest on the shoulders of the education system. The erosion of traditional values within our society, it's created fertile ground for the woke mind virus to thrive. It's exacerbated the mental health crisis that's gripping our nation. But it's not the only thing that's the problem. And if we're to reverse course and reclaim the promise of America for future generations, we have to prioritize the restoration of the traditional values within our educational system. Things like faith, family, and patriotism must be celebrated and upheld as the bedrock of our society. Our education system wasn't always just about the 3 R's that we don't even teach that anymore. Our education system was based on virtue, was based on discipline, respect, a sense of nationhood, a national identity. And as we moved away from that, hopelessness and despair engulfed our youth. Now, we need to take a quick break, but when we get back, I want to focus on the traditional values, how they've been undermined. And as people have moved away from these values, how it has left an entire generation vulnerable. So hang tight, we'll be right back. Welcome back, everyone. So let's take a look at the disintegration of religion, family, and patriotism within our society. These are 3 foundational pillars that have long defined American exceptionalism. And as we examine the profound impact of the decline, we're confronted with a new reality. The erosion of these institutions, essential institutions, is the main driver behind the crisis that is facing today's youth. You know, research, it consistently underscores the profound impact faith, marriage, and family have on human happiness, on human fulfillment. See, the family unit in particular provides a level of love, companionship, support, a sense of purpose that no government or social program can ever replicate. Children who come from stable families are more likely to flourish academically, flourish socially and emotionally. They also exhibit lower rates of mental health issues, including anxiety and depression. Yet, despite the overwhelming evidence supporting the importance of these institutions, we're witnessing a seismic shift in the attitudes of younger Americans. And according to a Wall Street Journal survey, patriotism, once a cornerstone of national identity, is now deemed very important by only 23% of a younger generation, of those under the age of 30. Only 23% believe patriotism is very important. How can we survive? But why wouldn't they think that way? Of course they're going to think that way when they're told what a horrible country America is. Look at those under the age of 30 that emphasize the importance of having children. It's only 23% of them that believe having children is important in life. Look at the surge in vasectomies amongst males. Even fewer prioritize the idea of community involvement. And only 31% prioritize religion and faith in their lives. Now, this decline in traditional values is alarming, as faith and family have long been recognized as essential components to a fulfilling and rewarding life, a purposeful life, as their essential parts and provide nourishment for our souls. We've walked away from them. We've abandoned these values. And a recent analysis of the literature on religion and happiness found that 79% of studies on this topic concluded that people with faith, quote, lead a measurable increase in happiness, end quote. A 2012 Duke study showed that people who are more religious or spiritual, quote, have better mental health and adapt more quickly to health problems, end quote. Children who come from stable families are more likely to flourish and less likely to experience mental health issues. Yet we have witnessed the exact opposite. We have witnessed a decline in stable families, a complete breakdown of the family unit. As our pews grow more desolate and American families become more fractured with the surging number of fatherless homes, the moral compass that once guided our nation has faltered. 40% of children today are born to single mothers, a figure that's doubled since 1980. And this runs across all demographic groups, with the exception of Asian Americans. Not for nothing, but parents. Parents are a big part of the problem. So we could look at the education system, we could look at technology, and certainly put blame there, but we also have to look internally at the idea of parenting. We can't just blame kids for the problems that exist. Parents have to reclaim their role as parents. They need to provide guidance, discipline, moral instruction to their children. Men in particular must step up as fathers, be responsible role models for their families, teaching values like respect and integrity, teaching values of hard work and accountability, teaching them that chivalry is not dead. Many in the United States, many parents around this country, they don't pay attention to what's going on in their child's lives. Not for nothing, but we overemphasize things like sports and other extracurricular activities, and we overemphasize them over traditional values and academics. How many parents actually sit there and really talk to their children? I'm not talking about the BS superficial conversations. I'm talking about meaningful conversations. How many families actually sit down at the dinner table at night, each and every night? How many do that anymore? And I know for some it may be impossible because of work, but again, for a whole host of people, that's not the problem. And again, we got to figure out priorities. If you can't sit around the dinner table, well, maybe you could do it around the breakfast table. Many parents, they want to shuttle their kids from one activity to another. They prioritize these activities over everything else. We're like personal chauffeurs in this day and age. Okay, when we were growing up, 80s and 90s and even early 2000s, there weren't all these activities that existed. And I'm not saying that sports and extracurricular activities aren't important. They certainly are, because they teach students. They teach students to operate in different environments, in team environments. With sports, you're getting physical exercise. God only knows that we need that. But we cannot sit there and forsake the things that matter so much more in life, the things that are so much more important. As I said last week, we prioritize all the wrong things. And for too long, we've prioritized material possessions over the things that actually provide value in our lives, give meaning to our lives. We focus so much that material possessions equals happiness, but despite the abundance of stuff, we have more stuff than ever before. Well, we find ourselves more miserable than ever. We find so many more people, even though they have so much stuff, they lack happiness. They lack fulfillment and purpose. And it's time to realign our priorities and recognize the importance of the traditional values of faith, family, and patriotism. Rather than value the things that don't really matter in the grand scheme of everything, we should encourage our youth to build out meaningful relationships, to speak to one another, to make friends, to pursue purpose-driven goals. We have to disassociate this idea that happiness comes from material possessions. We have to move away from that. We have to move beyond the instant gratification of today. So the relationship aspect is important, but it's not the only thing. We also need to encourage young adults to actively participate in their community through civic organizations. And I'm talking about organizations like the Knights of Columbus, the Order of the Elks, the Lions Club, the League of Women Voters. Now, in full disclosure, I am a member of the Knights of Columbus. However, that's not the point. The point is that whenever you go to these civic organizations today, organizations that are supposed to be deeply embedded in the community, when you go to the meetings and you look around, they're all aging out. It's not young people there. I'm one of the youngest people in my lodge when it comes to the Knights of Columbus. And that's true around the country. It's sad when you look at it, that an entire generation has turned their back on these civic organizations. They don't even know these organizations exist. But these organizations are extremely important because they prioritize community service. They prioritize active participation. They also serve as networking opportunities. They instill purpose. They instill the idea that there's a greater sense than self. And so we should be actively encouraging young people to join these types of groups, to get involved. If we want to address the mental health struggles of young Americans, we have to recognize the problems that we face. Problems both within the education system, like the curricula that's based on woke ideology, like our curriculums focused on knowledge over indoctrination, but we also have to focus on our own failures, on our own shortcomings, on the breakdown of the family unit, how we haven't lived up to what we should be as parents, where we say, no, we have to get to the pews. We have to go and practice and exercise our faith. How many people identify with a faith, a religion? I don't care what religion it is, and yet they never go. There's always an excuse not to go to the church or the temple or the mosque. There's always an excuse. Well, what are we teaching our kids? That extracurricular activities take precedence over our faith? That life's just too busy, and so we got to cut out the faith and family aspect? So we need to fix the educational system. We should have curriculums based on critical thinking, reasoning, comprehensive understanding of civics, our nation's history and values, which would instill resilience and confidence in their young minds. We have to make sure our education system is no longer cultivating an environment of despair, but at the same time, we also have to look internally and make changes in our own lives. We have to be the ones that fuel the younger generation with a sense of optimism toward the future. We have to, again, strengthen the bonds that bring us together in society. This means fostering those relationships, which would inevitably alleviate a lot of the mental health epidemic that plagues our youth. And if we don't, history has shown us time and time again that when faith and family are replaced with despair, tyranny and oppression are guaranteed to follow. Because if you don't have faith and family, well, then you replace the void with government. And it's an insidious agenda, an agenda that seeks to replace the moral and spiritual foundation of our society with a vision that leads us further astray from the principles that made us such an exceptional nation. As an American, I have a duty to defend these fundamental values, and so do you. We have a duty to preserve the truths that have shaped our nation's identity and ensure it exists for the next generation of Americans. With that being said, if you found the content of this episode informative, please share it with your family and friends, particularly those that have little children, because they need to realize what's going on. It's their future. Listen, I'm beyond the point. I probably lived half my life already. Okay, so it's not like I worry about my future and the America I'm going to grow up in. I've said it time and time again on this podcast that it's about my children. I want them to have the same America that I had when I was growing up. Now, I'm still young enough. I'm not past, my good days. I'm still young enough where I will have to bear the burden of anything that happens within our society as we move towards a more authoritarian model. But my children will have to live the rest of their lives in that way. And I don't want to see that happen. You shouldn't want to see that happen either. So share this episode with your family and friends. And if you found the content informative, take 30 seconds to write a review on any podcast platform that allows it. Also leave a 5-star rating. That's something I always appreciate. I want to thank you for joining me today, and I'll be back on Monday with another great episode of the P.A.S. Report podcast.
Thank you for listening to the P.A.S. Report Weekly Roundup Podcast.
Have a good one. Bye.
Be sure to rate, share, and subscribe to the podcast so you'll never miss an episode. Also, visit PASreport.com and follow us on Twitter at PAS Report.